In the quiet town of Ashford, Kentucky, the Crawford family lived in a grand farmhouse that stood proudly on a hill. From the outside, they were everything a family aspired to be: prosperous farmers, respected by neighbors, God-fearing and hard-working. Yet behind the polished wooden doors, there lived a secret older than the farmhouse itself. Whispers followed the Crawfords like shadows. In hushed tones at church gatherings, neighbors spoke of a strange affliction that appeared every few decades, always in one child, always with the same cruel signature: a trembling hand, a faltering step, a mind that seemed to unravel far too early. It wasn't spoken openly, it was feared. Some called it a curse. Others said it was God's judgment for sins buried in the family's past. But in truth, it was neither. It was something far colder, something science had not yet given a name to, a genetic nightmare woven into their blood. And in the year 1873, it appeared once again in young Thomas Crawford. Thomas was only 10 years old, with a face too bright for the shadows he carried. His eyes gleamed with the innocence of childhood, but his body betrayed him. When he walked, his legs shivered beneath his weight, making every step look uncertain. When he tried to speak, his tongue stumbled over words. At first, his mother, Eleanor, convinced herself it was clumsiness. "He'll grow out of it," she whispered, pressing her hands tightly as though her faith alone could hold her boy steady. But in the quiet of night, when Thomas's fits grew worse and his cries echoed through the halls, Eleanor knew the truth she had tried to bury. Her son had inherited the family curse. Thomas himself didn't understand why his body failed him. He only knew that when he played tag with the other boys, he was always the one caught first. He only knew that when he laughed, sometimes the laugh turned into a stutter, and others laughed back not in joy, but in mockery. The nightmare had chosen its victim. Desperate, the Crawfords summoned a traveling physician, a stern man with a beard that brushed his collar. He examined Thomas carefully, noting every tremor, every slur in his speech, every twitch that the boy could not control. Finally, the doctor looked at Eleanor and Samuel Crawford, his eyes filled with the weight of truth. "This is no curse of spirits," he said, "nor punishment from above. It is a condition of the body, something passed from kin to kin. Your boy suffers what others in his line have suffered before him." Eleanor's heart shattered. She had prayed for deliverance, for a miracle. Instead, she was given confirmation of her deepest fear. Samuel, silent and stoic, only clenched his fists. Medicine in 1873 was still in its infancy. There were no cures, no treatments, only warnings. The doctor offered them nothing but a cruel reality. "This may grow worse as he grows older. You must prepare yourselves." But how does one prepare to watch their child fade piece by piece? Eleanor carried the heaviest burden. She remembered her own brother, William, who had suffered the same cruel illness. She remembered how he lost control of his hands by 18, his speech by 20, and his life by 21. She had buried those memories deep, hoping that by marrying Samuel Crawford and leaving her childhood home, she had escaped the shadow. But shadows travel silently, and now the disease had found her son. Every night she sat by Thomas's bed, smoothing his hair as his hands twitched in restless sleep. She prayed fiercely, her voice cracking, "Lord, give him strength where mine has failed." But deep inside, guilt gnawed at her. Was it her blood that poisoned him? Was she the reason her child's laughter was tainted with pain? The truth haunted her more than the whispers of the town. A mother's heart carries every wound her child bears, and Eleanor felt her own heart tearing apart each day. Thomas's symptoms grew worse. Children can be cruel, even without understanding why. At school, Thomas struggled to keep up. His hands shook when he tried to write his letters, smearing ink across the page. When he read aloud, his words stumbled, tripping over his tongue. The other children laughed, mimicking his stammer until the classroom rang with mockery. They called him Twitchy Tom. One afternoon, after tripping and spilling his slate on the ground, Thomas's classmates burst into laughter. His face burned red. "I didn't choose this," he shouted, his voice cracking between rage and sorrow. The room fell silent for a moment before the giggles returned, sharper than before. Thomas ran home, tears streaming down his face. When Eleanor tried to comfort him, he pushed her hands away. "Why am I like this, Mama? Why can't I be normal like the others?" It was the first time she realized her son knew that something inside him was broken, and worse, he believed it was his fault. Samuel Crawford was a man of few words. Where Eleanor wept openly, Samuel buried his grief in silence. But Thomas, curious and sensitive, began to notice things his father never intended him to hear. One evening, long after he was supposed to be asleep, Thomas heard his father speaking in hushed tones to Eleanor by the fireplace. "It took my father," Samuel said, his voice heavy. "It took my sister. And now it takes my boy." Thomas's heart clenched. Until then, he had thought his illness was something strange and new, something unique to him. But now he understood. It was a chain, and he was the next link. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the rafters stretching like bars of a cage. For the first time, Thomas didn't just feel broken. He felt doomed. Eleanor refused to let despair consume her son. She brought him paints and brushes, thinking that perhaps his trembling hands might find peace in color. At first, Thomas protested. His strokes were messy, his lines unsteady, but soon he discovered something magical. The colors didn't need perfection to be beautiful. He painted skies so blue they looked like windows to another world. He painted fields of wildflowers where he imagined himself running freely, legs strong and swift. For hours, the tremors didn't matter. For hours, he was not twitchy Tom. He was an artist. Eleanor watched from the doorway as her son's smile returned, soft and genuine, the way it had been before the illness had marked him. She realized that while she couldn't cure his body, she could still feed his spirit. For a flicker of time, hope returned to the Crawford household, but the world beyond their farmhouse was not so forgiving. Ashford was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and rumors spread faster than the river in spring. By the time Thomas was 16, the whispers had grown louder. Families warned their daughters not to court a Crawford. "That sickness runs in their blood," they whispered. "Marry into that family, and you invite the curse into your own children." Thomas noticed the change in how people looked at him, eyes filled not with kindness, but with pity and fear. Even his sister Clara felt the sting. Suitors who once admired her beauty suddenly kept their distance, their mothers whispering in their ears. The Crawfords bore not only the illness, but also the shame it carried. They were no longer just a family. They were a warning. Clara, Thomas's older sister, refused to bow to fear. One evening, after hearing yet another cruel comment about their cursed blood, she slammed her hand on the table. "We are more than blood," she declared. "We are more than what they whisper about us." Her words rang in the farmhouse like a battle cry. She spent her days standing beside Thomas, defending him at school, challenging anyone who dared mock him. She became his shield, his fiercest protector. But Clara's defiance was more than just for Thomas. Deep inside, she was fighting for herself, too. She would not let a family illness erase her dreams of love and a future. She would not let fear dictate who she was allowed to become. Her courage planted a seed in Thomas's heart, a lesson that illness did not define worth, and dignity could still grow in cursed soil. Episode 10. Thomas's First Love. Despite the weight of his illness, Thomas found himself drawn to Mary Whitfield, a girl with kind eyes who often defended him when others mocked. She saw past his trembling hands, past his stammering speech. With Mary, Thomas felt like a boy again, not a burden. For a brief time, they shared stolen moments, walks by the river, whispered dreams of the future, even laughter that felt genuine and free. Thomas dared to believe he was worthy of love. But when Mary's parents discovered their affection, everything shattered. "You'll doom our grandchildren," her father thundered. "That sickness will follow you forever. You are forbidden from seeing him again." Mary wept, but her family's word was final. She disappeared from Thomas's life, leaving behind only silence. Heartbroken, Thomas withdrew from the world. The boy who once painted skies full of color now locked away his brushes. He whispered to himself at night, "Who could ever choose me, knowing what I carry?" The nightmare had stolen his first love. Eleanor's health declined after years of carrying both guilt and grief. She sensed her time was short, and though she feared leaving her children, she wanted her words to remain as a light in their darkness. At her bedside, she penned letters to Thomas and Clara. In Thomas's, she wrote, "My sweet boy, you are more than what trembles in your hands. You are more than the illness in your blood. The world may tell you that you are broken, but I have seen your spirit. It is whole and unshakable. Promise me you will not let this illness decide who you are." To Clara, she wrote, "Protect your brother, but do not let his suffering chain your heart. Live, love, and dream without fear." Eleanor passed away that winter, leaving the letters sealed in a wooden box by her bedside. When Thomas found his, he pressed it to his chest and wept. Though his body betrayed him, her words gave him strength. Her voice would guide generations long after her own was silenced. Years rolled on, and the Crawford line grew. Clara married a man brave enough to see beyond the family's shadows, and though whispers followed, she bore children with pride. Her grandson, William, grew up listening to hushed stories of the curse. Unlike others, he didn't shrink from it. He grew fascinated. By the time William reached adulthood in the early 1900s, medicine had advanced. Scientists were beginning to study illnesses that ran in families. William became a physician, driven by something deeper than curiosity. It was love for his family and the ghost of Thomas, who never lived the life he deserved. He pored over medical journals by candlelight, compared case notes, and realized something astonishing. The Crawfords were not alone. Families across the world carried similar illnesses, repeating like cruel echoes through bloodlines. For the first time, the Crawfords' nightmare had a name: a hereditary disease. It was not a curse. It was not punishment. It was science, waiting to be understood. William shared his findings with his family, but the older Crawfords struggled to accept them. They had been raised believing in curses and God's judgment. Still, William's passion was undeniable. He explained how traits like hair color or eye shape could pass through generations. So too could illness. Though the idea frightened them, it also brought relief. The Crawfords were not cursed by heaven. They were simply part of the human struggle. William's research, though modest compared to later discoveries, became part of the growing field of neurology. He published small articles, hoping his work might help families like his. In his lifetime, there was no cure, but knowledge itself was power. For the first time, the Crawfords looked at their suffering differently. The shame began to lift. They were not bearers of sin. They were contributors to science. It didn't erase the pain, but it transformed their story into something greater than themselves. Generations passed, and the Crawfords continued to grow. By the early 1900s, Clara's great-granddaughter, Anna, fell in love with a man named Joseph. Unlike Mary Whitfield decades earlier, Joseph knew of the Crawford history, and still chose her. "I don't care what may come," Joseph said, holding her trembling hand. "We'll face it together." His words were more than romance. They were rebellion against fear itself. Anna wept in gratitude, for she knew how her Uncle Thomas's love story had ended in heartbreak. Their marriage was not free of worry, but it was full of courage. In choosing love despite risk, Anna showed that the illness did not have the final word. Her children were born into a family that spoke less of curses and more of resilience. Though the illness still lingered in their blood, compassion had begun to grow stronger than fear. But the illness did not vanish with hope. Anna's firstborn son, James, began showing the same tremors in his teenage years. His legs grew weak, and his hands betrayed him when he tried to farm. Anna wept, remembering her ancestor Thomas. The nightmare had returned, reminding her that courage could not erase reality. Yet unlike Thomas, James lived in a time where medicine had names and words for his condition. There were doctors who studied him, medicines that eased some symptoms, and neighbors who, though still fearful, began to see the illness as something human, not cursed. James carried the burden, but he carried it with dignity, and his family carried him, ensuring that the old shame would never return. The Crawfords began a new tradition, writing their stories. In leather-bound journals, each generation recorded their struggles, their lessons, and their victories. No longer did they bury their pain in silence. Thomas's paintings, Eleanor's letters, William's research, all were preserved as pieces of a greater legacy. They called it the lesson in our blood. Every child was taught that while their illness might weaken their bodies, it could never weaken their spirits. Their history became not a chain of despair, but a torch passed from hand to hand. What once felt like a nightmare was slowly transformed into testimony. By the mid-20th century, science had leaped forward. Researchers identified the genetic roots of many hereditary diseases. What William once theorized was now confirmed by laboratories, microscopes, and research centers. Though cures were still far away, understanding grew. Families like the Crawfords were no longer whispered about as cursed, but studied, respected, and even admired for their resilience. Some scientists even traced breakthroughs in neurology back to early notes from physicians like William Crawford. The family that once bore shame now bore pride. Knowing their pain had contributed to healing others, the world was catching up to what Eleanor had once written in her letter, "We are more than what flows in our veins. We are what we give to the world." In the 1960s, Michael Crawford, Thomas's great-great-grandson, stood at the gravesite of the old farmhouse cemetery. The stones were weathered, the names nearly faded, but the stories still lived. He knelt at Thomas's grave, the boy who once painted skies brighter than reality, and whispered, "They said you were cursed, but you were brave. You carried more weight than anyone should. Because of you, we stand stronger." Michael had grown up healthy, but he carried the memory of those before him. He vowed to never let the younger Crawfords feel shame for their illness. Instead, he told their stories at family gatherings, ensuring Thomas, Eleanor, Clara, and William were never forgotten. For the first time in generations, the Crawfords felt pride in their history. By 2023, a young Crawford descendant named Lily stumbled upon the old journals. She sat cross-legged on the floor, reading Eleanor's tear-stained letter and William's fragile research notes. Like Thomas, Lily carried the gene. She trembled when she walked and stuttered when she spoke. But unlike Thomas, she lived in a world of advanced treatments, supportive communities, and knowledge. She decided she would not hide. Inspired by her ancestors, she chose to study medicine, like William had once done, and vowed to dedicate her life to genetic research. She wanted to turn her family's suffering into breakthroughs for others. The nightmare had shaped her, yes, but it had also given her purpose. The Crawford story stretched across 150 years, from hushed whispers of curses to bright laboratories searching for cures. A genetic nightmare had haunted them since 1873, stealing childhoods, breaking hearts, and testing their strength. But woven between the sorrow was something stronger: resilience. Each generation passed down more than illness. They passed down love, courage, and hope. What was once shame became legacy. What was once called a curse became a reason to fight for others. And in the end, the twist was not the illness itself. It was the family's response to it. Because while blood may carry nightmares, it can also carry strength, compassion, and the will to turn pain into purpose. The Crawfords proved that even the darkest inheritance can be transformed into light.